Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Maggie for setting up the whole series. I know that it's a lot of work. I'm so excited that the FBLPL is hosting this. I'm on the board of the Appleton Public Library. I even wore my pin. I didn't bring my Lawrence name tag. I brought my Appleton Public Library name tag. And we send the signal, like, so you know, like, this is the library guy. I'm on your side, right? One of us. It's just things like this, libraries in general, the community they provide, the space, it's just so important, especially right now. So I'm happy to be here at the library. So I've realized that my shadow is covering some of this, so I'll try to be on the sides a little bit. I walk around and I use my hands. I try to limit it a little bit. So my name is Jason Brozek. I teach at Lawrence. I've been there since 2008, and I'm in the government department, but at a place like Lawrence, like a lot of small liberal arts colleges, that doesn't mean very much because we all wear a lot of hats and we all do a lot of things. And so I teach a lot of courses in political science and international relations, but I'm also affiliated with our environmental studies program and our interdisciplinary global studies program. Just tomorrow, for example, I'm teaching one class with a case study on the intentional discharge of waste oil from ocean-going tankers, and another case study on transboundary freshwater conflicts, and then another class about the birth of the environmental justice movement and the escalation into global climate justice. Just a few days ago, I was talking about tariffs in my intro to international relations class, and I got so worked up that my abs were sore, and that's just for me, it's this is just what I really enjoy about the job. Is that I'm not talking about one thing, I'm talking about lots of things. And so I teach classes in environmental policy, in international relations, in international organizations, international law. And I also teach, at least I did until a few years ago, I teach the course in US foreign policy. And I did that for a long, long time. It was my favorite course to teach because it's not really an international relations course, it's a US politics course. But I knew folks in my department who teach US politics didn't want to do it. And so, you know, either I do it or nobody does it. I thought somebody should do it. So, and then the last time I taught it was so Lawrence is on a trimester system. So this was our winter term the first year of the first Trump administration. And that entire term, I was really having a lot of trouble finding the balance between current events and theory of foreign policy. Because I don't want to teach I don't want to teach just an abstract theoretical course, but I don't teach current events. We use those as a tool to try to understand something more fundamental about the policymaking process or about how politics works. But it's not like a breaking news. It's not a current events class. And I kept really struggling to find this balance as I was teaching US foreign policy that term, just like endlessly getting frustrated about finding the right way to bring in some of what was happening, some of which was so sort of norm breaking and boundary pushing in the Trump administration without getting carried away by that, but also not being so abstract and vague and theoretical that we weren't talking about the real politics that was happening. So I spent the entire 10 weeks feeling like I was going too far one direction or the other and feeling disappointed and frustrated. And then the day of the final exam, where one of the essay questions that I gave to my students was about the checks and balances between the president as the chief executive of the executive branch and the cabinet ministers. Political science, we call it a principal agent problem, that the president has an agenda, cabinet ministers, right, his appointees might have their own agenda. And so how do they keep each other in check? That's essentially the question. What are the tools available for the president to keep these individuals in check? So that was one of the essays that I assigned to my students.
Down button?
I'm clicking the down one. Oh no,
Oh,
maybe I'm too far away.
come on, it just worked for us.
Did it time out? Try this.
Now try.
There we
Okay.
go.
Woo.
Got it. And so as my students were taking the exam where they were writing this essay, Trump fired Rex Tillerson on Twitter. And so I had to break into my own final exam with breaking news to say, hey, just so you know, that essay question just became extra relevant. And that was my breaking point. That was the point where I decided I'm not teaching this class anymore. I have plenty of other things I can teach. I can teach an extra global environmental politics class, which I love doing. So this class is required. It's entirely an elective, and I elect not to do it anymore. So I stopped in the spring of 2018, and I haven't taught it again since then. Until so sort of the origin story of a project that I've been working on now for the last 8 to 9 months, maybe a little bit more. One of the things that I do, one of the hats that I wear at Lawrence is to recruit every year someone named the Distinguished Visiting Scarff Professor. So the Scarff family made the donation that created my position, and the agreement was part of my responsibility at Lawrence would be to bring in for a couple of weeks every year someone with practical foreign policy experience, a former ambassador, a former diplomat, right? Someone like this. The very first one was McGeorge Bundy. I just heard the video mention Kennedy's circle of advisors. That included McGeorge Bundy, who was part of the 13 days conversations. He was on NextCom. So I wasn't there for that. That was before my time. But part of my responsibility was going to be to continue this process of recruiting these people. And a couple of years ago, I recruited a former diplomat named Elizabeth Shackelford, who had resigned during the first Trump administration, right around this time, actually. She wrote a memoir about her time called The Descent Channel. And I just thought she was really intriguing. She was great in the classroom, and I wanted to bring her to campus for a couple of weeks to give some talks, visit some classes. One of the talks that she gave was called How U.S. Foreign Policy Really Works. And she laid out this model of the tools of U.S. foreign policy, and then these forces that help drive which administration chooses which tools in which situations. And afterward, I chatted with her, this was toward the end of her 2 weeks, so we were friends at this point. I chatted with her and said, Lizzie, if there was a book that was laid out the way that talk was, I might be convinced to teach U.S. foreign policy again, because it hit the right note. And that was a little spark that led to a book proposal. And so this is the project that Elizabeth and I have been working on for the past few months. We're not at the point where we have a cover yet. So you're just gonna have to use your imagination. It's great, I'm sure. But I don't know yet. We came together and really thought about how to turn her 40-minute talk into a book that's meant for a general audience. This is not meant for practitioners. Ideally, this is the sort of thing that would be used in a foreign policy class, like the one that I have taught before. And back when I thought we were past the point where I had to worry about the Trump administration foreign policy, at the point where I really thought Harris and Walz were going to win, I rescheduled myself for U.S. foreign policy set it up last summer. And so it's on my teaching schedule for next term. And it turns out we're not going to have a Harris administration foreign policy. We're going to have a Trump 2.0 foreign policy. And I'm going to assign a draft. I hope a pretty close to finished draft of the book. And we're going to work through it. We're going to read it. We're going to think about it together. And I've been thinking a lot about whether now is exactly the right time or just the worst time to be writing a book called How U.S. Foreign Policy Really Works. While I was drafting the chapter on military intervention. I was right in the middle of writing this chapter, and Trump launched airstrikes on Iran. It moved me so much that I ended up adding the New York Times push notification to the opening chapter of that book. While Lizzie was drafting the chapter on diplomacy and the role of the State Department and foreign service officers and ambassadors. The Secretary of State laid off third to half of the workforce, including lots of her former colleagues and friends. So while she was working on that chapter, and so it really does feel like we are still trying to ride that line that I was doing in class, which is to write something about how US foreign policy works that is responsive to, but not taken away by what is happening in the news every day. So that's a challenge that I've been thinking a lot about. And so that's sort of driven how I've been thinking about it. And so when Maggie reached out about doing this talk, I thought, well, great, I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking a lot about this. I'm thinking probably too much about this, more than is maybe healthy for me. And so this is what I wanted to start with. This is what I wanted to share. Just a couple of weeks ago, the new Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, in Davos, the World Economic Forum, said, this moment is, quote, the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a harsh reality. In the same speech at the World Economic Forum, he said, let me be direct. We're in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. This rupture, not a transition line has gotten some traction. You may have run into it before. Mark Carney is Canadian, so I want to be very polite about this, but gently, respectfully, I'm not sure I 100% agree. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that just a little bit. This, in a nutshell, is my thesis about the second Trump administration and foreign policy, America's place in the world, international politics, the whole shebang. This is my thesis. And this is not how international politics works, and yet, in a lot of ways, this is kind of exactly how international politics and foreign policy works. So yes, the international order is being rewritten in some pretty fundamental ways, or rewritten or unraveling or dismantled or demolished, sort of your call there. But I think it has been for a while. Not the beginning of something new, not a new rupture, but maybe the end point of an ongoing process. So if I can sort of preview where I'm headed a little bit to the conclusion. I think the question about the international order, the international system, is whether it's worth saving or preserving or not. And I say yes, but if so, how? So I want to just start by thinking about what do we mean by the liberal international order? This thing that's being rewritten or demolished or whatever language you want to use. What's its origin story? What is it? I think if we're thinking about the liberal international order as a set of organizational principles. It's a lot of things, right? It's international treaties, it's institutions, it's international organizations, shared values, norms, expectations of what behavior is legitimate or illegitimate, right or wrong. It covers trade, it covers economic development, monetary issues, defense, national security, nuclear weapons, human rights, the environment, and more, right? It promotes, it's a system that promotes cooperation and stability. And I want to just give you, the text is a little small up here, but at this point, really nobody but Lizzie and I and our editor has read anything from the book. So you're really the test audience here. So this is a little snippet from the draft about the liberal international order. I'm thinking here about the origins, right? That the narrative of US leadership and primacy comes in this period after the end of World War II. And that's an economic story. It's a story of an economic boom and a baby boom. It's a story of expansion and technological change, of interstates, of prosperity, of victory, and really US leadership in the world. But it's also a story of international institutions. It's a story of the United Nations. It's a story of the World Bank. It's a story of the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization. And all of these institutions that make up the international order that in many cases were led by the United States and serve the interests of the United States. So that's relatively vague, right? But these are things you know, right? The World Trade Organization and the Genocide Convention both fall under this umbrella. The US has led some of these things. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, was really the brainchild and the work, the blood and the sweat and the tears of Eleanor Roosevelt. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when I have my students read it in class, one of the things they notice is that there are these clear echoes of the US Bill of Rights. The US was the champion of an organization that never came to exist called the International Trade Organization, as well as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, and then later the World Trade Organization. So right, some of these the United States has led and championed. Others it's opted out of. Famously, the Kyoto Protocol, for example, the United States chose not to participate in. Others, the United States has actively resisted. This is an example I love to share with students. One of my favorite examples of US resistance to the liberal international order is the International Criminal Court, which the United States has never joined. We didn't sign or ratify the treaty that established the International Criminal Court. So we're not a member. We don't fall under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. No US citizens could be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court because we haven't voluntarily joined the International Criminal Court. Now, one of the other paths to be prosecuted for war crimes would be the UN Security Council surrendering a person or ordering a person to be charged. The US has veto power on the Security Council, so we're not going to do that either. So there really is no world in which a US citizen could be tried for war crimes or crimes against humanity, genocide, anything before the International Criminal Court. And yet, the US objection to the International Criminal Court runs so deep that during the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, Congress passed a law called the US Service Member Protection Act, which gave the president, as commander-in-chief, standing authorization to invade the Netherlands, where the International Criminal Court is based, if any US citizen, which would never happen, again, there's no possibility, there's no avenue for this to happen, but if any US citizen somehow miraculously ended up being charged and tried by the International Criminal Court, the president has open-ended standing authorization from Congress to invade the Netherlands. Like to just sort of, right, send the troops into The Hague and rescue that person. So in some cases, US opposition to this is really profound, but overall, the United States has really benefited from this system. And so for the most part, we've led it because we benefit from it. It's benefited the rest of the world too, but it's benefited the United States. This has not been an act of generosity. A couple of weeks ago, Lizzie, my co-author, and I wrote an op-ed for the Chicago Tribune about this topic. Right, the argument we made, this serves the interest of the United States, and being a global bully does not serve the interest of the United States. One of the lines I really liked, and I thought was most relevant for tonight, right, is that right, the Trump administration has denounced this international order. It's undermined exactly those institutions that shaped the international order. We were responding in a lot of ways to an interview that Stephen Miller had done where he talked about this post-World War II period that the United States was groveling and begging for international acceptance. But I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the United States was getting out of this post-World War II liberal international order, right? This was when and where and why and how the United States became the global power it was. We've benefited from that system, and as Lizzie and I wrote, we're probably not going to like whatever comes next. So let me just take a couple of other examples, just quick examples. Be mindful of time. One is, right, I teach environmental politics. That's my area more than anything else. In 1972, the international community came together in Stockholm, Sweden for the first time at a conference called the Stockholm Conference. It was meant to be the first global multilateral convening to talk about shared environmental challenges. There had been environmental politics before that, obviously. There had been environmental regulation, but it was mostly sort of local. And so this was an effort to really try to light a spark under the idea that there were global environmental responsibilities, and the right way to address global challenges was global cooperation and building global institutions. That conference in 1972 eventually led to the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, which was a follow-up conference with the same sort of agenda. One of the documents produced at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 was the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in 1994, the FCCC, or the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is still in a lot of ways the fundamental international treaty for addressing greenhouse gas emissions. In 1994, that treaty was created, and one of the things that it did that I think was really prophetic was call for annual follow-up meetings. So every November or December, there's what's called a conference of parties. And so everyone who has ratified, everyone who's a member of this institution, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, comes back together for a couple of weeks and tries to negotiate to do more, to address more issues, to reduce further, to try to solve this problem of climate change. So this happened in 1994 at the third COP in 1997, COP3 in Kyoto, Japan. There was an extension, right, a treaty called the Kyoto Protocol to try to address climate change. That eventually failed. Talk about why. It's a longer story, but after the failure of Kyoto, the international community came together at another COP, COP21 in Paris, and in 2015, drafted, signed, and ratified the Paris Climate Agreement. And so if we think about the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Climate Agreement, they all got their start with this 1994 agreement called the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is the foundation upon which everything else is built. I have time to tell you this. I was talking to some students last term because it was right, I was teaching global environmental politics. It was the 10th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so, you know, we read the text of the thing. We really got into it. We spent a couple of weeks on it as sort of a deep case study. And to me, the Paris Climate Agreement is still like the brand new thing. It's sort of like it's still got its glossy shine on it, right? It's the newest thing there is. One of my students pointed out to me and said, "Oh, 2015, I was in third grade." And I collapsed, immediately just collapsed into a pile of dust. Third grade really bothers me to teach young people when they remind me that they're young people and that I am not a young person anymore. US objection to, this is where I'm going with this, right? This is not how international politics works, but in a lot of ways, this is exactly how international politics works. US objection to this process is long-standing. Go into the archives of the New York Times a little bit here. So this is from 2001. So at this point, the Paris Climate Agreement is a few years old. So most of the world has signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement by 2001. It's already operating for most of the world, but we've got a top above the fold headline in the New York Times about the Bush administration still opposing the Kyoto Protocol. Every time I go into the New York Times archive, I like to just look around a little bit. Like I find the headline I'm looking for, but I also like to look around. Like what else is happening? What else is it's a moment in time, right? So here's Timothy McVeigh being executed for the Oklahoma City bombing. And it also struck me that at the bottom here, Microsoft seems interested in our phones and our computers somehow being combined with each other. I don't, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. That doesn't seem likely. This opposition continued. Right? So during the first Trump administration, after the Obama administration had negotiated and committed the United States to the Paris Climate Agreement, the brand new climate agreement that nobody was in third grade during, the first Trump administration pulled the United States out of it, right? Uncommitted the United States from the new Paris Climate Agreements. At the same time, or sorry, not at the same time, in the next administration, the Biden administration recommitted the United States to the new Paris Climate Agreement. And then in the second Trump administration, the US withdrew one more time. there was a panel at Lawrence. It was a faculty panel at Lawrence about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. We were talking about what we expect in the first year of the new second Trump administration. And I was talking about environmental politics, and I said, I expect the Trump administration to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. It was a campaign promise. They've done it once. I don't see any reason that they won't do it again, right? I fully expect that to happen. So that's not what I'm watching for. What I'll be watching for is whether the Trump administration withdraws from the underlying framework convention on climate change, right? That's the foundation upon which everything else is built. And so that's what I wanted to watch for. And I said, I don't think it's going to happen, right? That would mean a real withdrawal from this liberal international order. And I haven't seen a movement in that direction. Obviously, I'm a moron and I was wrong and naive and not cynical enough because just a couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration announced that, in fact, they would be withdrawing from the underlying UN Framework Convention. So they are pulling out of the underlying treaty. Makes me feel a little naive for not being more cynical about it, that I didn't expect that. And I guess makes me wonder what's next. Right? As I think about this process, what would be the next step that I feel like I would be too cynical to say, but maybe I should, right? Is it pulling out of the United Nations? Maybe. I thought a year ago that this wasn't possible, but maybe I should be more, cynical. Here's another case study. Thinking about how this is not how international politics works, but also this is exactly how international politics works. You've been thinking about Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro. So last month, the United States Trump administration engaged in a military operation to arrest, to remove the Venezuelan president. I mean, for my money, nobody's going to miss Maduro very much. I think just at a personal level. But I think it raises maybe a bigger foreign policy question, which is, can the president do that? Is that what's going on? Is that allowed? Can you just sort of like send some helicopters in and arrest the president of some other place? Not according to James Madison, not according to the Constitution of the United States. So this is from one of the founding fathers, James Madison, fourth president, writing in a series of letters that he exchanged with Alexander Hamilton, who was, I assume, writing these and not singing these, but writing under the pseudonyms Helvidius and Pacificus about the executive foreign policy, especially the war-making authority of the president versus Congress. And I just thought this was a profound prophetic line from James Madison, right? In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found. Right at this point, the ink is barely dry on the parchment. And here's James Madison, who helped craft it, right? Saying, in this document, this founding document, there is no wiser part, no wiser section than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department. So James Madison has some thoughts about who ought to be in charge of, say, well, he was probably not thinking about helicopters so much, but whatever, the 1790s equivalent of a helicopter. We zoom forward a few decades to the beginning of the U.S. Civil War. We have another conversation in U.S. foreign policy history about this question of what exactly can the president do? What's the president's authority here? Because it doesn't come from the Constitution. So where does it come from exactly? In 1861, Abraham Lincoln, so the origin story of the Civil War, famously launched a naval blockade on the Confederacy. And in a series of court decisions called the prize cases, the Supreme Court ruled that the president was constrained. There were some boundaries, right? There were some guardrails on the president's war-making authority. But in fact, the president does have the idea, or does have the authority to, and I wrote down the exact quote, the president may repel sudden attacks as commander-in-chief. So right, Congress has this authority, but right, in 1861, Supreme Court was like, well, the president ought to have the ability to repel sudden attacks. This was framed at the time, right, contemporaneously, this was framed as a restraint, right? This was a way to constrain the president's war-making authority. But that's not really the way that it's played out. Instead, this really solidified the idea that the president can act without Congress when it comes to issues of national defense. It really laid the foundation for the latitude and the deference that Congress shows to the president in matters of war, all the way up to the present day, with some little hiccups. We get these moments where Congress tries to claw some of that authority back. It is their constitutional power, after all. This is an Article 1 power granted by the Constitution to Congress. There have been moments where they try to claw some of that power back. One of those moments was in 1973, when they passed and then overrode the veto of President Nixon, the War Powers Resolution. Again, an official effort to rein in the president with various guidelines that the president only has a handful of days. Only under certain circumstances can the president engage in military action without congressional approval. Needs to come and sort of notify Congress. Legally, those look like constraints. Practically, they're only constraints that Congress really cares enough to do anything about it. Since I'm pulling up New York Times archives again, always looking at the other headlines. President Nixon here has no intention of leaving the White House, apparently. So, I don't know how that turned out either. Phones, computers, presidents resigning, all sorts of things. You could never predict. So this congressional oversight, the congressional authority, which has been over generations, over decades, ceded more and more and more to the president, could be clawed back, right? Could be retaken if Congress decided to, but in this case, like in almost every case, they've chosen not to. I think there was a conversation I had about whether it's easier for them not to have this authority to give it to someone else who can then be blamed when things go wrong. But ultimately, we can go back to Venezuela and we get presidential executive orders about oil revenue, really sort of like nakedly laying out the motivations for this military action and the response by Congress, who again has the constitutional authority to declare war, to use the military in this way. Congress declines even to pass any sort of constraints on the president's authority here. This is another thing that Lucy and I are writing about in the book. Trying to summarize this history a little bit. And this is a shorter version of what I was saying, right? That the Congress, as well as the judiciary, have really deferred to, they've ceded their constitutional authority over national security, over defense, to the president. It's resulted in these weaker checks and balances. The outcome of that, the result of that is that decisions about military intervention are almost solely and exclusively within the purview of the president wearing his commander-in-chief. Venezuela, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, right, these things don't stand alone. Iran, Greenland, tariffs, World Health Organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, according to some analysts, dozens and dozens of organizations that the U.S. has either pulled out of or is going to pull out of. So what I want to ask then is how do we make sense of this? What is going on? Maybe the question I ask more than any other. What's happening? I think maybe there's three answers to this, and I want to spend a little time on each one of them, and then I'll wrap. I think there's maybe three answers to the very important "what the heck is going on here" question. I think one answer is that whatever's going on is temporary, and that's good. I think it could also be temporary and bad. I think it could also be permanent and very, very bad. So those are my three possible answers to what's going on. Temporary, good version, temporary, bad version, and permanent, very, very bad version. What does it mean to think about sort of what's going on? The liberal international order, America's place in the world, temporary, but a good version of temporary. The United States and allies, the rest of the world value US leadership. Right, because it's led to a system that's been stable and predictable. It's led to a lot of prosperity and growth and improvements in security, improvements in public health, financial benefits. It's benefited the United States, but it's also benefited the rest of the world, and they want it back. And so this is temporary, but it's good. In my environmental politics class last week, we listened to an episode of The Daily. So this may be on some of your podcast feeds if you listen to podcasts. Depending on the metrics you use, this is maybe the second most listened to podcast behind the Joe Rogan Experience. So for what it's worth. But this is the New York Times Daily Podcast. This is an early one. And I wanted to listen to it with my students because I wanted to just capture this moment in time. So this episode of The Daily about the Paris Climate Agreement came out in 2017. And this was right at the moment where the Trump administration had been in office for a little while. The 2016 election had happened. We had the inauguration in January of 2017. So a couple of months past that. The Trump administration was making some noise at this point about really going through with it, to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. And so this episode was thinking like, what would happen if, this is why I wanted my students to listen to it as a moment in time. We zoom back to 2017, where my students were toddlers or something. I don't have any idea, babies, rocked in their parents' arms. What does it look like to land on this moment and ask ourselves, like, what would happen if the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement? And one of the things that a guest on the podcast said, I'm quoting him here now, if we wind up walking away for the 4 years of this administration and then coming back under some new administration, side note, like editorial note, nailed it, right? It may not be all that damaging. A lot of the countries have said, we'll go forward without the United States if necessary, and then they'll play a little catch up with the rest of us when things are back to normal in America. That's a version of, this is temporary. We're asking what's going on. This is temporary. Things will go back to normal. We want this system. The system benefits the United States. The system benefits the rest of the world. It's predictable. It's stable. It's led to a lot of great outcomes. This is temporary, and that's fine. There's also a version of the answer. It's temporary, but bad. The story here looks a little different. I think the story here goes, the United States has now become perceived as an untrustworthy partner. We are unpredictable. We're undependable. That foreign policy becomes based on the whim of a new president every 4 years. If the State Department has to be rebuilt from the foundation every decade or so, then really what good is US diplomacy? What do promises, what do commitments of the United States even mean, right? How do they even matter? They're just empty words that the next president could pull back. That's not trust, right? That's essentially, this is just sort of cheap bluffs. We essentially, right, we leave ourselves with only one foreign policy tool. If we can't make promises because nobody trusts us, then all we leave ourselves with are threats, right? Foreign policy becomes all stick and no carrot. Because we might elect someone who doesn't believe in eating vegetables. This is, in a nutshell, this is the French position, the EU position on Greenland and Denmark and NATO. There was a Le Monde headline from just a couple of days ago that really struck me in this vein, and I'm quoting it here. Trump has struck at the heart of the defense pact forged between the US and Europe in 1949. Trust. In a world where where the United States is too erratic and too trustworthy for NATO. That's feels like that is temporary, but in a bad way. That it's temporary, it might happen again. And who knows? It's unpredictable. But I do think, as I sort of round the corner to wrap up here, I think there's a version of this where it's not temporary, where we are seeing something new. And I think that is very, very bad in a lot of ways. And this is essentially Prime Minister Carney's argument at the World Economic Forum in Davos, that this is the beginning of a new world. A world that's essentially without the United States, or at least without US leadership. Either a world that leaves the United States behind, a world in which, right, the United States is just one more in a string of failed empires. It's the end, in other words, of the American century and the end of the world order that it brought. What might replace it? Something that looks a little, right, a little more like pre-World War II. Something that looks like spheres of influence. And we certainly see flashes of that in communications from the Trump administration. This is an official post from the State Department saying this is our hemisphere. So thinking about the role of the United States in Venezuela, conveying a sense of ownership of a sovereign independent state. I do think that is conveying a different view of the world. We get this editorial cartoon playing off the 19th century Monroe Doctrine with the Don Roe Doctrine, where the United States and its giant tie are standing astride the Western Hemisphere, protecting them or perhaps attacking them with a baseball bat. This was posted by Trump's campaign and reposted on X by the Secretary of Defense. I refuse to call it Secretary of War. So that would look like a very different world, moving to something different, not in a temporary way, but a new, to use a phrase, right, a new world order. That we are potentially in the dawn of a new and different age, struggling to be born, time of monsters, all of that. Ultimately, like bringing it back around, right? And I think the question is whether this way of international politics, of international organizations, of international treaties, of shared expectations and norms, is this way of international politics, the way that it has worked in the post-World War II period, is it worth protecting, worth preserving? Is it worth defending? I think so in general, right? It's not perfect, but it is more peaceful, it's more interconnected. Standard of living has improved in terms of health and nutrition, education, infant mortality, maternal health, and more. So my hope is that the answer, as we watch foreign policy over the last 3 years of the Trump administration, is that we land on temporary but good, or at least okay, if good is too far to hope for. I wanted to make a couple of if I could recommend one book about this. I would take a look at Richard Haas's A World in Disarray. So Haas is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. I really like this book. It's really accessible. He's written it for a general audience. And the argument he's making is that the work of the United States to build this liberal international order, the work of the United States in the decades after World War II, served the interest of the United States. It was the best world for us. But in being the best world for us, it was also good for everyone else. And that in a world of disarray, to use the title of his book, the United States can't be great, to use someone else's language. So if I could recommend one book, it would be this book. I could recommend two books. I would recommend that book and Robert Kagan's Jason Brozek. So Robert Kagan is a political historian. He works for the Carnegie Endowment. He also wrote just this incredible history of U.S. imperialism called Dangerous Nation. So if you're looking for it's a thick one, though. It's a sort of a 600 pager. But Robert Kagan's new book about the world order and America's place in it is also really good. It has some really nice overlap with Richard Haas's book. And he refers to the liberal order as precarious, right? It's not a permanent state of affairs. It's not gravity. It's a thing that we've made. And that thing we made is precarious and precious. And it needs tending because in the jungle, the world doesn't thrive. So if I could recommend 2 books, those would be the 2. I could recommend 3 books. All right, that's all.